Okay. So obviously with all this Black Lives Matter situation that's going on at the moment, there's a hell of a lot of people being active on social media. Obviously you've got your insane racists that are coming out. You've got your closet racists that are saying their bit. You've got plenty of people who are coming out in support, which is fantastic. I just wanted to add something to it. One of the posts I've seen floating around recently is that there's, what is it? It's no one's born to be racist, and you've got the picture of a little black hand and a little white hand, baby hands, and they're touching each other. Or you've got the picture of the video of the little black kid running up to the little white kid, and they give each other a hug, which is awesome, and I think that's helpful. I think there's more context to that, and I don't quite agree with it. So I wanted to go through a couple of scientific sets of research I haven't done. I'm not a scientist. I'm just a guy who's seen a couple of things on the internet and thought about a couple of things. So everything I talk about, please research it. Yeah, please research it. Don't take my word for it. But so here's why I don't quite believe that the whole idea that everyone isn't born to be racist. So what's the first thing we need to talk about? So the context of this is that we are an animal, basically. We're an animal that's been the same type for between 300 to 400,000 of years. Yeah. So if you don't believe in science, if you don't believe in evolution, you believe that humans have been humans since the dawn of time, as we are, in the image of God and so forth. If you do believe in evolution, you believe we've been this type or this form of this species for about 300 to 400,000 years. But in either case, we've been this type of this species for way longer than this type of civilization. Yeah, so we're built for a different time. That's a fact. So most of our instincts are geared up around survival, and survival in a different time, completely different time to what we're living now. So here are a couple of ways that our brains are hardwired, our instincts and our survival instincts kick in, that have been helpful, but they don't necessarily help. Okay, so the first thing we need to think about is that we think in categories. So humans think in categories. So when you're making your way around town, you're driving down the road, you don't necessarily process, okay, that's a pigeon, that's a magpie, that's an oak tree, that's birch, that's a terraced house, that's a Victorian house, whatever. You're not processing that. You're processing house, scenery. Is there a danger? If you're driving, you're thinking, am I going to hit anyone? Those kind of things. You're thinking in categories, right? That's a helpful tool. If we weren't thinking in categories all the time, we would never get anything done. We'd never be able to process anything. Here's one of the ways that manifests itself. So scientists have looked at, if you take a rainbow, using the language skills that I have, same as you will look at that rainbow. I'll identify the parts of that I see as red. I'll identify the parts of that I see as yellow, parts of that I see as orange, and so forth. I'll call all of that section red, yellow, or orange, right? Even though the rainbow is the full spectrum of colour. There's no beginning or end during it to one section or another. It's one constant stream of colour. It's just my brain helping me categorize so that I can list to you what colors are in that rainbow, right? Where it gets a bit tricky is that if you give that test to somebody of a different language, they will identify different parts of it because they're using their language, i.e. their categories, to help them divide that up, right? So there's how we do think in chunks, even when there aren't necessarily natural chunks to consider, and how our thought process differs. From depending on your culture, your language, and so forth. So that's categories. We also need to think about we have a natural fear of the unknown. So again, it's a survival instinct. Any species or any animal that doesn't have a fear of the unknown isn't going to survive that long. Taking humans, any human that's wandering around in history hugging bears and tigers and so forth, that isn't going to work out for them. They're not going to do that well at passing on their genes, right? So we have a natural fear of the unknown. If a purple person landed on the planet tomorrow, we might go to greet it. We might be all kinds of wanting to make friends with it, but we would all be cautious because that's how our brains work, and that's a sensible thing. We have and sort of we're hardwired to think about the continuance of our DNA, right? So we know that's why we are constantly looking to procreate. You don't have to be told to have children. People naturally want to have that. Not every individual, but generally speaking, across the species, across all animals, we are hardwired to work in that way. And there are a lot of other behaviours that are all wrapped around that. How many resources, i.e., how much money you have, you know, what your homemaking skills are like. They're all wrapped around this affinity to pass on your DNA. That works in other ways too, manifests itself in other ways. There's a fairly popular saying in biology. The saying is, I'd lay down my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. And that's basically a way of saying that 2 brothers represent 100% of my DNA between them, but then so do 8 cousins. And so as part of me wanting to pass on my DNA, I will think about, I'll protect my kids first, you will yours. Next off in line are going to be my nieces and nephews, you know, and then further down the line it might be my cousins, my distant cousins, and so forth. But 2 brothers to humans will equal, not to humans, to all animals, will equal 8 cousins. So Google that. Don't just take my word for it. Google that phrase, 2 brothers, 8 cousins. You'll find out a bit more about that. So that starts off with DNA. But that moves into, we have an affinity to look after our kin group. What's the term? Kin selection. And so as part of me looking after my own and making sure my own continues on, that stretches to my community, my people I see around me, people who feel like they represent me. Yeah. So I want, as well as my immediate family, I want my wider family. Now you think in our small communities, families are all interwoven, right? In a small community, you're all family. It's all carrying forward your genes. In big cities, that doesn't work so much, right? Big towns and so forth. But we're hardwired to go down the scale and think about our immediate groups that we identify as, right? And you can see this when, so you take a bunch of guys and they're watching a boxing match, and there's a black guy and a Mexican fighting, and a bunch of black guys are there and a bunch of Mexicans are there. If you looked at the numbers, the black guys are going to you don't know who these 2 people are. Black guys are going to support the black guys, or the black fighter. The Mexicans are going to support the Mexican. The white guys are going to support the white guy. And that's what you're supposed to do, that, you know, when England play football, everyone's supposed to support England in this country, right? It's like a known, accepted thing. You're supposed to support your kin group, and that will, depending on the circumstance, that will get further and further away from you. So you'll be representing a whole town or a whole country or whatever, but you will always pick your kin group, and that is part of, you want your type of DNA to survive, right? There's another thing that again furthers that, is the empathy gap. So they've done research on this too. The empathy gap is following on from the kin group or the kin selection. When you hear stories or are in certain circumstances that show empathy, that will lessen the less you feel you identify with the person. So the more I identify with the person, the more empathy I feel for their story. So a better example of that is one of the tests that they've done. They've done many. One of them is, okay, so they create a story and they show it to a bunch of people. This person's a recording telling a story. They show some people a picture of a white person and they say, this is the person telling the story. They show some people a picture of a black person and they say, this is the person telling the story. When it's a white person who thinks it's a white person they're listening to, they pay more attention to the story. More things happen in the brain. They listen to the story for longer. When it's a white person think it's a black person, they do less so. But it's also the same in reverse, right? And this doesn't just work for race. It works for sex. Works for other types of ways that ways that you see yourself. So religious groups and so forth. That's a known thing. It's an empathy gap, right? So it's another thing to look into. Another thing we need to think about is a negative bias. So it's another survival instinct that we have. And so what this means is basically we're hardwired to pay attention to negative information because it's more useful in survival. If I'm an early human and I'm taking routes to the water stream, say I take 10 different routes on 10 different days. The first 9 days, I discover a nice easy route, lovely scenery, has an apple tree for me to pick from on my way. And on the 10th day, I take a different route and I discover it's got a bear in it. That is way more likely to trigger and store in my brain because it's helpful information, right? So and you can see this if you were to walk to the newsagents tomorrow and you saw a newspaper on there that said 6.9 billion people lived safely yesterday, and then the next newspaper said there was a fire down the road, you'd buy the one that had the story about the fire because that's more interesting to you. Why? Because we have a negative bias, right? That 6.9 billion people lived perfectly fine is not, even though in magnitude that's bigger than the fire story, that's not interesting to us, right? So another thing we need to think about is system 1 and system 2 brain. So this is something they talk about in psychology. They use this in marketing as well. And it's not that we have 2 brains and so forth. We just have 2 different thought processes that happen. So system 1 is your subconscious automatic process, your emotional process of thinking. And they say that governs 98% of your thought process, right? System 2 is your emotional rational, and it normally comes afterwards. So I have a feeling, I seek through all of my memories and experiences, I attach context to it, and then I attempt to explain that in my memories to myself and so forth. So when you put your hand on a fire, you don't think, oh my gosh, that's a fire, I must have leant on the cooker. You get the signal to your brain, move your hand, and then you process all the context afterwards. And you think about, okay, I'm going to memorize not to go near that, or think about when it's hot and so forth. It's a terrible example, but you kind of get it, right? We have that with humans as well. You have a feeling and then you apportion logic to it afterwards. And that works with your negative bias as well, because once I've decided I don't like someone, I'm looking at all the evidence I can find. I knew that guy was funny. I just don't look at the way he walks, look at the way he carries himself. I'm now looking for evidence. So that's confirmation bias in play as well as system 1, system 2. So these are all ways that we're hardwired to work. So let's have a look, right? So the first one, made some notes. So we think in categories. Yeah, we have a fear of the unknown. We know that we are more likely we have more of an affinity to groups that we see our DNA in, our kin groups. We have less empathy for groups that seem further away from us in terms of DNA and how we identify ourselves. And we have a system that allows us to make irrational decisions and then try to apportion rational logic afterwards to ourselves, right? And so you can see all these ways that they were helpful in survival situations, when we were earlier in life, before this type of civilizations of cities and towns and so forth. But they're not so helpful when we are all living together. We are also multicultural and life is just different, So I think knowing that is helpful. You need to understand that. It's probably less helpful to think that we were all supposed to love each other and from birth we all just love each other automatically. That's probably less realistic. And then also, if you think that and then you have a negative emotion, you're more likely to start looking for logic. Okay, I was scared of that guy because he's a dodgy guy, because of all these other things that I've heard and so forth. When what's more helpful is if you just catch yourself doing it and laugh, you catch yourself having an emotion and just laugh about it. I walk past a group of fighting age males and they happen to be a different ethnic group to me. I don't have to tell myself all these lies about why that ethnic group's dangerous and I need to worry about it. Most likely, I was just had a little bit of a moment because it was a group of fighting age males. Yeah. And if I catch myself having those thoughts, you just laugh at yourself. Yeah, we don't act on all of our impulses. We have impulses to procreate, like we've talked about. We don't act on every impulse we have to copulate with somebody. You know, that wouldn't work in this society. You don't act on every impulse you have to eat, or to eat whatever you like. You know that that's an impulse that you have because you're an animal of some kind, very sophisticated kind. But you know to ignore that. That's not your conscious talking. That's your inner animal. And I think we need to approach racism in the same way. We have internal struggles, but we have a really strong conscience that we can just move that to one side. But first we need to understand it. So yeah, are we all naturally born to love each other? No, I don't think so. Does that mean we can? Yeah, we can treat each other with the right amount of respect. And hey, listen, I'm not saying that you have to go up and hug everyone on the street. Some people aren't worth it. Treat everyone as you normally would do. If I don't trust people, I'm not saying I have to go out and trust everyone tomorrow. I could just treat everyone equally, right? We're not looking for a false world. Yeah. All it is you just need to understand a bit more about how your brain works. Thanks.